The house woke before anyone else did. Light slipped through tall windows and spilled across polished floors that reflected it back in cold, perfect lines. Every room was arranged with intention, chairs aligned, tables cleared, silence preserved like a rule rather than a comfort. It was the kind of place where sound felt intrusive, where even footsteps seemed to apologize as they echoed. At the far end of the east wing, behind a door always kept half closed, 2 children sat at a low table. Their fingers traced the grain of the wood as if memorizing it. They did this every morning. One counted softly under his breath. The other hummed a tune that never quite settled into a melody. Their eyes remained unfocused, gazes fixed on nothing at all, exactly as they had been taught. Everyone said they were blind. Doctors had said it first, years ago, their voices solemn and precise. Specialists had repeated it with new charts and expensive words. Caregivers learned to say it gently, as though softness could lessen the permanence. Blind since birth. No light perception. No cure. The phrase became a fact, then a shield, then an identity. Their father believed facts more than anything else. He believed in measurable things, profits, losses, growth curves, contracts signed in ink so dark it looked final. Emotion, to him, was unpredictable. Love had once failed him spectacularly, leaving him with 2 infants and a grief so sharp it taught him distance as survival. He provided everything. The best tutors. The best food. The best care money could buy. What he never provided was himself. That wing of the house existed almost apart from the rest, quiet and carefully managed. The children learned the sound of every step on the floor, the count of doors between their room and the dining area, the exact place where the carpet changed texture. They moved slowly, cautiously, hands raised just enough to look convincing. It was a performance they had practiced so long it felt natural. No one questioned it anymore. When the new maid arrived, it happened without ceremony. No announcement. No interest. She was shown where the cleaning supplies were kept, told which rooms were off limits, which routines were sacred. Her uniform was plain, her voice soft, her presence easy to ignore. That suited everyone just fine. She noticed the quiet first. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind stretched too thin, like silence holding its breath. She noticed how the staff avoided the east wing unless instructed. How conversation stopped when the children passed, as if sound itself might hurt them. She noticed how their father never lingered, how he spoke to them with careful kindness, like a man addressing something fragile he didn't know how to fix. On her second morning, she was assigned to help guide the children from their room to breakfast. A simple task. She offered her arm. They took it automatically, fingers light but sure. Too sure, she thought, for children who had never seen the world. Halfway down the corridor, a beam of sunlight broke through the windows, bright and sudden. One of the boys turned his head toward it. Just for a moment. Just long enough. He caught himself instantly, chin dropping, shoulders tightening. His brother stiffened too, as if reacting to a cue only they understood. "I'm sorry," the first boy whispered, though nothing had happened. She said nothing. She kept walking. But her heart didn't slow. At breakfast, she stayed nearby, wiping a counter that didn't need wiping. The children ate neatly, methodically. No spills. No searching hands. When a glass was moved slightly to the left, one reached for it without hesitation. When a spoon rolled near the edge of the table, the other caught it before it fell. She told herself there were explanations. Muscle memory. Familiarity. Years of routine. Still, her eyes followed them. Later, as she dusted the sitting room outside their wing, she heard laughter, quiet, unguarded. She paused. Through the crack of the door, she saw them playing a game with small stones, arranging them into patterns on the floor. One stone slipped, rolled away. One boy watched it go. Watched. Her breath caught. The boy froze, eyes flicking up to the doorway. When he saw her, his face went blank. He blinked rapidly, then lowered his gaze, hands lifting in the careful, searching way everyone expected. "I dropped it," he said softly. She handed him the stone. Their fingers brushed. He flinched, not from fear, but from something closer to panic. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image replayed again and again. The sunlight. The stone. The way the children tracked movement when they thought no one was looking. She had seen many things in her life. Pain. Pretending. Survival disguised as obedience. By the third day, she knew it wasn't coincidence. She began small, testing nothing that could be called proof. She spoke from different corners of the room, changing positions without sound. The children turned toward her voice, not just generally, but precisely. She placed objects quietly within reach, then moved them when they weren't touching them. Their hands went to the new positions without hesitation. Once, she let a curtain fall open suddenly. Both boys blinked hard, pupils shrinking before they remembered themselves. No one else noticed. No one wanted to. The house ran on assumption. On a story repeated so often it had hardened into truth. Blind children. Tragic but handled. No one looked closely because looking closely meant responsibility. Their father passed her one evening in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, expression tight with numbers and negotiations. He barely nodded at her. To him, she was part of the background, necessary, replaceable, unseen. If only he knew. On the fourth day, she stayed behind after dinner to tidy the children's room. They sat on the bed, waiting patiently, hands folded. She moved slowly, deliberately. When she reached for a book on the shelf, she pulled it free, then placed it back upside down. A small sound escaped one of the boys before he could stop it, a confused inhale. The other kicked him lightly, warning. She turned. Smiled gently. Said nothing. Her chest felt tight. Not with triumph, but with sadness so sharp it almost hurt to breathe. Whatever this was, it wasn't a game. It was learned. Conditioned. A response to something long buried and deeply feared. That night she heard their father arguing on the phone, his voice low and controlled, words like liability and protection drifting through the corridor. She wondered how many decisions had been made for these children without ever asking them what they needed. Before leaving the room, she knelt in front of them. "You're very careful," she said quietly. Their shoulders tensed. Silence stretched. "You don't have to be with me," she added. One of them swallowed. The other pressed his lips together, holding something back. She stood, turned off the light, and left them in the darkness everyone believed was all they knew. Outside, in the hallway, she rested her hand against the wall, steadying herself. She understood now. Whatever secret lived inside that room had been built brick by brick, lie by lie, out of fear and expectation. And if she was right, then everything about this house, its rules, its routines, its silence, was wrong. Behind her, unseen, a man stood at the end of the corridor, watching the door she had just closed, his face pale, his certainty beginning to fracture. He didn't know it yet, but the story he had lived by for 7 years was already starting to fall apart. The next morning began the same way it always did, which somehow made everything feel heavier. Routine had a way of pretending nothing was wrong. Breakfast arrived at the same time. Footsteps followed the same paths. Voices stayed measured and polite. But beneath it all, tension moved like a low current, unseen and undeniable. She watched more carefully now. The children were quieter than usual. Their movements were sharper, more controlled, as if every step required calculation. They clung closer to one another, whispering in fragments when they thought no one could hear. When she approached, they fell silent instantly. At breakfast, a tray slipped from a server's hands and clattered loudly against the floor. Both boys jumped hard. One squeezed his eyes shut too tightly, the way people do when light hurts. The other flinched, then froze, hands hovering in the air as if unsure what expression he was supposed to wear. A few people glanced over. Someone laughed it off. "They're sensitive," a voice said quickly. She noticed how fast the excuse came. Too fast. Like a reflex practiced many times before. Later that day, visitors arrived. Important ones. The kind that filled the house with forced smiles and lowered voices. She was instructed to stay nearby but invisible, to serve drinks and disappear. That suited her just fine. The children were brought into the sitting room, seated neatly on the sofa. They were told to smile, to be polite, to answer questions softly. They did exactly as expected. One of the guests leaned forward, curiosity thinly veiled behind pity. "Must be so difficult," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Raising children like that. And in a house so visual." Another chuckled. "At least they don't know what they're missing." The words landed heavily. She felt it then, anger rising sharp and hot, but she stayed still. This wasn't about her pride. This was about the way everyone in the room spoke, as if the children weren't there. As if blindness had erased their humanity. One of the boys clenched his jaw. "She's here," he said suddenly, nodding toward her voice. The room paused. The guest blinked. "Good ears," he said with an awkward smile. "Too awkward." The other boy shifted, fingers curling into the fabric of the couch. His gaze flickered upward, tracking movement across the room before he remembered himself. He dropped his head instantly. No one noticed. Except her. She carried the moment with her the rest of the day, every detail replaying itself with cruel clarity. By evening, she felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. This wasn't harmless misunderstanding anymore. This was damage happening in real time. That night, she asked to read to them. The request was met with mild surprise. It wasn't forbidden, just unnecessary, people said. Why bother with pictures and pages when sound was all they had? She smiled and said she'd describe everything. They agreed reluctantly. She sat on the floor instead of a chair, voice low and steady. As she read, she shifted slowly, carefully, changing her position without announcing it. Each time she moved, their heads followed. Their eyes followed. When she stopped reading mid-sentence, neither child spoke. They waited. She turned the page silently. Still nothing. Then she resumed from a different spot in the room. Both boys turned in unison. Her breath caught, but she kept her voice calm. She finished the chapter, closed the book, and thanked them as if nothing had happened. Behind her, unseen, someone stood very still in the doorway. The next day, the house buzzed with tension. Staff whispered. Instructions were repeated twice. The children were kept closer than usual, supervised more strictly. Their father's presence lingered in the hallways longer than before, though he never crossed the threshold into their room. She could feel the resistance now. A quiet tightening, like the house itself was pushing back. In the afternoon, a tutor arrived unexpectedly early. Lessons began without warning. The children were given raised letter books and sound-based puzzles they had mastered years ago. The tutor moved quickly, confidently, assuming obedience. At one point, a page was turned the wrong way. One of the boys frowned. "That's upside down," he blurted out. Silence crashed into the room. The tutor laughed too loudly. "You're imagining it," she said, flipping the book again. The boy flushed, shrinking back into himself. She saw it all, the embarrassment, the fear, the instant regret for saying anything at all. Later, when she brought water, she caught their reflections in the window. The sunlight framed their faces. They were watching dust drift through the air, eyes wide with something dangerously close to longing. "Don't," one whispered to the other. "I just wanted to see it," the other replied. Her chest tightened. That evening, during dinner service, one of the guests made a comment she couldn't ignore. "At least they're well behaved," the man said, gesturing casually toward the children. "Some kids use disability as an excuse. These two know their place." Something snapped. The maid set the tray down harder than necessary. The sound rang out, sharp and final. "They're children," she said. The room froze. Every eye turned toward her. Shock flickered across faces unused to being challenged by someone like her. "I'm sorry?" the man asked, tone cool, offended. "They're children," she repeated, steady now. "And they hear everything you say." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. Another forced a laugh. The moment passed, but the damage lingered. Later that night, she was summoned. The conversation was brief. Polite. Warning disguised as concern. She was reminded of boundaries. Of her role. Of how sensitive the household situation was. She listened quietly. Then she asked one question. Have you ever tested them when they didn't know they were being tested? The air changed instantly. The man across from her said nothing. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked away, just for a moment. That was enough. Afterward, she returned to the children's room. They were sitting close together, whispering urgently. We messed up, one said. They're going to be mad, the other replied. She knelt in front of them. You didn't do anything wrong, she said softly. They looked at her, not blankly, not vaguely, but directly. Fully. Fear filled their faces. You're not supposed to know, one whispered. Her heart pounded. Know what? That we can see, the other said, voice shaking. Please don't tell. Before she could answer, footsteps approached in the hallway. Heavy. Familiar. Stopping just outside the door. The handle didn't turn. But someone stood there, listening. And inside the room, the truth hung in the air, fragile and exposed, seconds away from changing everything. The knock never came. Instead, the footsteps outside the door lingered, heavy and uncertain, before retreating down the corridor. The silence that followed felt louder than any confrontation. Inside the room, the children remained frozen, eyes wide, breaths shallow, as if the truth they had spoken might still be pulled back if they didn't move. She stayed kneeling in front of them, heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. I won't hurt you, she said quietly. But I need you to tell me everything. They hesitated. Years of discipline don't disappear in a moment. Fear had been trained into them carefully, reinforced with praise and protection, with warnings disguised as concern. Finally, one of them nodded. It started when we were little, he whispered. They said we couldn't see. Everyone did. So we believed them, the other added. At first. They spoke in turns, filling the gaps for each other, voices low and trembling. A doctor who never looked at them directly. A caregiver who panicked when they reacted to light. Adults who smiled when they stayed still, who praised them for being calm, quiet, obedient. Every time they acted like children, something went wrong. Someone cried. Someone raised their voice. Someone said they were making things harder. So we stopped, one said. We learned. Her throat tightened. This wasn't deception born of mischief. This was survival. She stayed with them until they slept, sitting on the floor so she wouldn't tower over them. When she finally stood, her legs felt weak. The truth felt heavy in her hands, like something fragile that could shatter if handled wrong. She didn't leave the wing immediately. She waited. Minutes later, footsteps returned. This time, the door opened. He stood there, tall and rigid, his expression controlled but his eyes restless. He didn't look at her at first. He looked at the children, sleeping peacefully, faces relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. How long? He asked quietly. She didn't pretend not to understand. Long enough. His jaw tightened. They're blind. No, she said. They were told they were. He shook his head slowly, as if rejecting something physically painful. We had tests. Specialists. Were they watching? She asked. Or were they assuming? Silence. She took a breath. Let me show you. The next morning, she asked for a moment alone with him and the children. No staff. No doctors. No audience. Reluctantly, he agreed. The children sat at the table, hands folded, faces pale with nerves. He stood behind them, arms crossed, posture stiff. She could feel his resistance like a wall. She didn't start with light or movement. She started with sound. She stood behind them and spoke their names, changing her distance and direction, softening and sharpening her voice. Each time, they turned their heads precisely. Not guessing. Not vaguely. Exactly. He frowned but said nothing. Then she rolled a small ball across the floor. Slowly. Silently. Both children tracked it with their eyes. The room seemed to tilt. "Stop," he said sharply. She didn't. She opened the curtains fully, letting sunlight flood the room. The children squinted, blinking rapidly, discomfort etched across their faces. One raised a hand instinctively to shield his eyes before catching himself. That was when something broke. He staggered back a step, breath catching, face straining of color. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't possible. They didn't fake fear," she said gently. "They learned it." He sank into the chair behind him, hands shaking now, control finally slipping. "Why would they lie to me?" She met his gaze. "Why would children pretend to be broken unless they thought it was the only way to be loved?" The words landed hard. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the boys slid off his chair and walked toward him. Walked. Straight and steady. "I didn't want you to be sad," the child said, voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone was so sad when they thought we couldn't see." Tears spilled freely now. He reached out, then hesitated, as if afraid to touch something real. When he finally pulled them into his arms, the sob that tore from his chest sounded like years collapsing at once. The house didn't know what to do with the truth. Staff whispered openly now. Some were defensive. Others ashamed. Doctors were called. Appointments scheduled. Reports pulled from files long ignored. The children were examined again, properly this time. Carefully. Thoroughly. The results came back undeniable. They could see. The confirmation didn't bring relief the way people expected. It brought anger. Guilt. Questions that had no easy answers. He paced the halls late into the night, replaying every moment he'd chosen distance over doubt, authority over curiosity. She watched from the edges, saying little, doing more. She worked with the children gently, helping them adjust to using their sight openly. Colors overwhelmed them at first. Depth made them dizzy. They laughed at reflections, stared too long at shadows, asked endless questions about things most people stopped noticing long ago. But fear lingered. They flinched whenever voices rose. They froze when adults entered rooms suddenly. They waited for punishment that never came. One evening, during dinner, a guest commented casually, "Amazing what modern medicine can do." The children stiffened instantly. Before anyone else could speak, she did. "This wasn't medicine," she said calmly. "This was listening." The table fell silent. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Gratitude flickered across his face, followed quickly by something deeper, respect. Later that night, he asked her to stay. "Not as staff," he said quietly. "As someone they trust." She considered it carefully. This wasn't a simple offer. Staying meant responsibility. It meant being seen. It meant not disappearing quietly the way she always had. "They need consistency," she said. "Not saviors." He nodded. "So do I." In the days that followed, accountability arrived like a storm. Contracts were terminated. Apologies were issued. Systems dismantled. The house began to change. Windows opened more often, voices softened, laughter allowed to linger. The children changed too. They stood taller. Asked questions without whispering. Reached for things without hesitation. And every now and then, when they thought no one was watching, they looked at her with a gratitude too big for words. But not everyone welcomed the truth. One former caregiver returned unexpectedly, demanding explanations, insisting nothing had been done wrong. Accusations flew. Threats of legal action whispered through the halls. That was when she revealed the last thing she had been holding back. She hadn't just noticed. She had documented everything. Dates. Behaviors. Contradictions. Quiet recordings of reactions and responses. Years of experience had taught her one thing above all else: truth needed proof to survive. She placed the file on the table and watched the color drain from the woman's face. The storm broke after that. As night settled over the house, calm returned in a way it never had before. The children slept deeply, without rehearsing who they were supposed to be. He stood by the window, staring out at a world he had kept his children from seeing, his reflection staring back at him. Behind him, she paused in the doorway. "This isn't the end," she said quietly. "It's the beginning. And it's going to be hard." He nodded slowly. "I know." Outside, the lights of the city glowed, sharp, bright, impossible to ignore. Morning arrived without ceremony, but everything felt different. The house no longer held its breath. Curtains were opened instead of left half-drawn. Light poured freely into rooms that had once been dimmed out of habit, not necessity. The silence that used to dominate the corridors was replaced by small, tentative sounds. Footsteps without caution, voices without whispers, laughter that startled itself before growing confident enough to stay. The children woke early. For the first time, they didn't wait for permission to leave their beds. They padded to the windows and pressed their hands against the glass, watching the sky change color as the sun rose. Pink bled into gold. Clouds shifted slowly, deliberately, as if putting on a show just for them. "It's brighter today," one said. "It's always been this bright," the other replied, then paused. "We just weren't allowed to say it." Those words echoed long after breakfast. Doctors returned later that week, not with solemn expressions this time, but with discomfort. Their questions were sharper. Their assessments more careful. Tests were repeated without assumptions filling in the gaps. The conclusions were clear, undeniable, and deeply embarrassing for more than one professional reputation. The children had full vision. What they lacked wasn't sight. It was permission. Apologies followed, some sincere, others polished and hollow. Letters arrived. Phone calls multiplied. Offers of silence in exchange for compensation appeared quietly, and were rejected just as quietly. There would be no covering this up. Not anymore. He made that decision himself. The staff responsible for reinforcing the lie were dismissed, not angrily, but firmly. There was no shouting. No public humiliation. Just consequences delivered without spectacle. It felt fitting. Years of quiet damage didn't need loud revenge, just accountability. The house learned to adjust. At first, it was awkward. The children bumped into things, not because they couldn't see, but because they were finally moving freely. Depth confused them. Distance had to be relearned. Colors overwhelmed them in waves, each one demanding attention. They asked questions constantly. Why did mirrors copy you? Why did shadows stretch? Why did people look different when they were sad, even if they smiled? She answered every one. She taught them names for things they had only imagined. She let them hold objects up close, then far away. She encouraged them to look, really look, without fear of being corrected. Their laughter changed too. It became louder, unrestrained, messy. It echoed down hallways that had never known it before. Their father watched it all, often from a distance, learning how to exist in the same space without controlling it. Guilt lingered, heavy and persistent, but he didn't turn away from it. He let it stay, let it teach him. One evening, he sat with them on the floor, something he had never done before. They showed him drawings, wild, colorful things filled with suns too big and people smiling too wide. "Is it wrong?" one asked nervously. "No," he said, voice thick. "It's beautiful." They didn't ask why his eyes were wet. The outside world responded more slowly. There were articles. Debates. Opinions from people who had never stepped inside the house but felt entitled to explain it anyway. Some blamed medicine. Some blamed parenting. Some blamed the children themselves. He ignored most of it. What mattered happened quietly, behind closed doors. One afternoon, a former caregiver returned uninvited, her voice sharp with accusation, insisting she had done nothing wrong. She demanded recognition, threatened lawsuits, claimed the children had deceived everyone. The children froze the moment they heard her voice. Old fears surged instantly. Before anyone else could react, she stepped forward. "They were children," she said calmly. "And you were the adult." The woman scoffed. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she replied. I understand what happens when fear is rewarded and curiosity is punished. She placed the folder on the table. Documentation. Notes. Dates. Patterns. Evidence gathered patiently, carefully, without anger clouding judgment. The argument ended there. The woman left without another word. That night, the children slept through the storm outside without waking. No nightmares. No rehearsed stillness. Just rest. Weeks passed. The house continued to change. Walls once filled with art chosen by decorators were replaced with drawings taped up unevenly. Furniture was rearranged to suit small feet instead of aesthetics. Music played softly in the evenings, not because someone scheduled it, but because someone wanted it. One afternoon, she packed her bag. Not to leave, but to move. A new room had been prepared for her closer to the children's wing. Not as staff quarters. As a place that said she belonged. She stood in the doorway, uncertain. You don't have to, he said quietly. I know, she replied. That's why it matters. Later, as the sun dipped low, the children dragged her outside. They wanted to see the garden at sunset. The light softened everything, turning green into gold, shadows long and gentle. One of them squinted, then laughed. It looks like the world is glowing. It always does at this hour, she said. They stood together in silence, watching the day end without fear of darkness returning. That night, as the house settled into sleep, he found her in the kitchen, washing a mug that was already clean. I don't know how to make this right, he said. You can't make it right, she answered gently. You can only make it honest. He nodded. Thank you, he said. Not as an employer. Not as a man used to power. Just as a father who had almost missed his children entirely. Months later, the story lost its sharp edges. It became something people referenced quietly, thoughtfully. A cautionary tale. A reminder. The children started school. A real one. They held hands on the first day, eyes wide, not with fear but with anticipation. They turned once at the gate and waved. She waved back. As they disappeared into the crowd, he stood beside her, silent. They see everything now, he said. She smiled softly. They always did. Inside the house, sunlight spilled across the floor again, uninterrupted, unfiltered, finally allowed to be exactly what it was. And in that light, the truth stood clear and undeniable. The ones everyone thought were blind had only been unseen.